There are few shipwrecks, at least of warships, quite as famous as USS Indianapolis. Even if you know absolutely nothing else about this ship, you've certainly heard of the sharks and blood in the water, or about the mess that was the prosecution of her captain, which I'll likely cover in a different video. And even if neither of those, you might know the role she played in the atomic bombing of Japan. Regardless of what you know Indianapolis for, she was a famous ship and an equally famous shipwreck. There were even a couple documentaries on her wreck, which I'll link in the description, though they aren't free to watch. Now, as her sinking is a very famous story, I'll only give the briefest of overviews before moving on to the wreck. In mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had largely ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Because of this, cruisers like USS Indianapolis could be used on less traditional roles, in her case as a fast transport, to carry enriched uranium and parts for Little Boy, one of the atomic bombs that would be dropped on Japan. After dropping that off at Tinian on July 26, 1945, Indianapolis set off to rejoin the American fleet on July 28th. She would never arrive. 2 days later, around midnight on July 30th, USS Indianapolis was struck by two Type 95 torpedoes from the submarine I-58. The first slammed into her bow, and the second hit amidships. The combination of the two hits, and secondary fires and explosions, doomed the cruiser. She sank within 12 minutes, taking about 300 men with her. That still left another 900 or so in the water. The story of their struggle to survive is well known. For days they drifted, attacked by sharks and fighting the elements. By the time the survivors were rescued, 900-odd men had been reduced to 316. As for their ship, Indianapolis vanished from history, although not from memory. In the early 21st century, efforts began to locate her wreck. An expedition in 2001 failed to find anything, which likely burned for the 4 survivors of the ship that had joined it. Another expedition in 2005 failed to find anything concrete. Then, come 2016, new information came to light. The day before Indianapolis was sunk, she sailed by LST-779. This tank landing ship noted the encounter, and from that record, a new search area was put together. Only a year later, on August 19, 2017, the wreck was finally located. Paul Allen's intrepid team on RV Petrel found the wreck at a depth of 18,000 feet, or 5,500 meters, one of the deepest shipwrecks ever located. As is typical with Petrel's discoveries, they never released the exact location. While Indianapolis is far too deep to be salvaged like the Java Sea wrecks, this was still a good decision. All of that being said, let's move to the wreck itself now. Beginning, of course, with the sonar. Much like the other discoveries Petrel made in the late 2010s, this is a large map of the wreck site. In the bottom corner, there's Indianapolis's main hull. This hit the bottom hard, creating a rather large impact crater around the wreck. It also crumpled her stern, as we'll see in more detail later on. Surrounding the wreck are a couple debris fields. To the north, a field of wreckage from her scout aircraft. And to the east, various parts of the ship herself. Notably, her 2 bow turrets and her bridge. With one 5-inch gun director in that debris field, and another far to the northeast. Even further to the northeast, the bow rests on its own. This broke off just ahead of her number 1 turret, looking at the sonar image of the wreck. That does wrap up the sonar, however, so let's move on to the wreck itself. This can begin with the picture that identified the wreck as Indianapolis. Her hull number eroded by the passage of time, but still visible. A bright white painted number 35, still as visible on the bottom as it was on the surface, seen here before she sank. Remaining with the hull, the next picture shows her bow, which seems to be half buried in the mud, at least judging from this picture of the area on the surface. Although, even with half of the bow buried, you can see some incredible preservation. The paint is largely intact, right down to the outline of a star, and the anchor chain is still in place. Unfortunately, there isn't really much more to say here, however, other than the fact you can see a break in the bow. A good chunk of it is flat out missing. That said, let's move on to the main hull. There are some interesting pictures to look at in this area. For example, as seen here, the barbette of the number 2 turret. The super-firing bow turret, if you prefer. As seen on the sonar, both of the forward turrets fell out as the cruiser sank. Nothing special in this case. What is weird is you have some fallout, but another remain in place. On Indianapolis, the bow turrets fell out, while the stern one remained on the ship. I'm not remotely enough of an engineer to make an accurate guess on why that happened. The best I could say is that maybe damage from the torpedo impact loosened the bow turrets enough to make them fall out. That's entirely a guess, however, so if a more qualified person chimes in, that's fine by me. In any event, this picture shows more of the excellent preservation that the wreck is known for. The blue tint does hide corrosion a bit, but the hull is broadly intact. A bit of paint remains as well. As for the barbette, it's a gaping hole leading into the ship, although not much detail can be seen here. Moving on, I wasn't able to find an image of the foremost barbette. Instead, have a picture of the bow turrets on the surface, to compare with as we look at the next picture of the super-firing turret's position. This is from a bit further out, and shows more of the ravages of time. The paint is visibly flaking away, and portholes are absolutely clogged with debris. It's certainly not the prettiest picture of this wreck. Even here, though, there are still some nice things. For example, right in center frame, there's an intact ladder. And a bit further to the left, an open hatch still hanging on its hinges. A violent sinking and 80 years underwater, yet that's still attached. Further to the bottom of the image, although not the focus of this picture, is the side of the hull. Here you get the first glimpse of her paint scheme. That will be seen in better focus later on, but it's there where the best preservation is located. Before I move to that, let's look at one more picture of the barbette area. A true color picture, zoomed in on the aforementioned doorway. Here, both the rust and the intact paint are far easier to make out. While the flaking is also more apparent, it's clear where the paint is still there. And for that matter, what the color of paint used to be. It also gives a good look at the interior of the ship. Admittedly, you still can't make out much other than scattered debris. With that rounding off this particular picture, there's only a couple images left before I move on to the side of the ship. For the first picture, we have the stern. As I mentioned earlier, this is collapsed in on itself. And when I say collapsed, I do mean that. The deck is crumpled in to the point the gun tubs are pointing nearly vertical. I wouldn't be surprised if the interior decks are completely collapsed here. Indianapolis sank quickly, and as the sonar crater shows, she went down to the bottom just as fast. The collapsed stern is almost certainly a mix of implosion damage and the force of the impact. There's not much else to make out here, however. As for the second image, it's, if anything, a bit rougher. I'm not entirely sure where this is on the ship, but I would guess the detached bridge. The reason for that is front and center in this picture. Two bells sitting in place on the wreck. A larger bell that's clogged with debris and more heavily corroded. And a smaller bell hanging from its mount and looking like it sank yesterday. Looking at that smaller bell and the other debris scattered about, this section of the ship is resting on its side. Most of it is pretty beat up and in very rough shape, with rusticles and no paint. In common with other examples of broken wreckage, it's difficult to say for sure what much of this actually is. I put an arrow to what look like storage chests of some sort, and another arrow pointing up at what might be a lookout area of some form. The damage does make it difficult to be sure. However, in the back of the image, you can see the paint scheme of the ship. Blue on white or gray. It's very difficult to make out what part of the ship this is, but the paint is clear and easy to see. Into the side shots. There are two of these to look at, beginning with this one. Here you can see the paint scheme of the ship in much better detail. White or gray over blue and a strip of black. There are certainly areas where it has corroded a bit more than others. For example, at the very top and right beneath the strip of white paint, there's a large circle of rust. Probably the more interesting damage, however, is at the bottom of the picture. I don't think that's from the torpedo, although it is the only visible damage in this area. A bit of metal bent out from the rest of the ship. It's interesting, no matter what sort of damage it is. For comparison's sake, on the paint scheme, here's a nice ship bucket image of Indianapolis at the time of her sinking. It shows how good looking the paint really is, even after 8 decades underwater. Now, as for the second side shot, this is from a bit further up. It might even be from the same area of the ship. What I can say for sure is that this one shows the paint a fair bit better, as well as some of the superstructure, which I believe is the barbette area from earlier. Other things to note in this picture are the portholes, with one damaged, and the deck. While it's covered in silt, the teak decking looks to be broadly intact. Not a surprise at the depth Indianapolis rests at, but always nice to see. Beyond that, it's another side shot of the hull, so let's move on. One last picture before the big guns. That picture being the anchor. Nothing special at first glance, other than the general level of preservation. However, if you look closer, you can still see the manufacturer's marks engraved on the anchor. Norfolk Navy Yard. And on the other side of the anchor, even the serial number and date of manufacture is still legible. That being said, it's time to move on. All that's left to cover on the wreck itself is the weaponry. I'll break this down into 3 sections. The 5-inch gun, the 40mm Bofors, and the stern triple turret. For the first picture, we have the 5-inch secondary gun. On Indianapolis, this would have been the older 5-inch 25 caliber model. Sitting on the bottom in the modern day, this gun is mostly intact. The mount is rusted and covered in mud, but everything is more or less where it should be. The gun sights are still mounted in place, as is the seat. Moreover, the elevation mechanism is still clearly visible. The gear that would be raised or lowered, depending on where the gun had to aim. As for the gun itself, the barrel isn't heavily rusted. It still remains pointing skyward, as if ready to engage the Japanese. A closer-in shot here demonstrates this even better. The original paint is still there. And if you look in the barrel, you can make out the rifling of the gun, as if it were still ready to fire, with a bit of cleaning up. For all of that, though, I think the 5-inch gun is the least interesting weapon here. If you've watched my other American shipwreck videos, it looks basically the same as a weapon on Lexington or Hornet. No, the really interesting weapons are yet to come. Starting with the Bofors seen here. From this distance, it doesn't look all that impressive. The gun tub is intact, and the mount itself is still there. That's good, but not really special either. Well, special in comparison to other wrecks. What's special about the Bofors guns on Indianapolis is closer in. Through all the mud, rust, and general debris, you can look at the back of the gun and see that these weapons are still loaded. The ammunition clips are still in place decades later, with the shell casings clearly visible. I can't recall seeing any other wreck with loaded Bofors guns. That's an almost unique sight, even on these well-preserved American shipwrecks. With that said, though, it's time to look at the big ticket item, as it were. The one remaining turret on the wreck. Her stern triple 8-inch turret. In stark contrast to the bow turrets, this one is still snugly in place, pointing straight aft. It was never rotated or moved at all, and it remains there to this day. This triple turret shows no signs of damage, although the stern behind it is crumpled in. About the only sign of damage to the turret itself is an opening that's clogged with debris and a ruined ladder right next to it. The turret itself is basically pristine, with the exception, as seen here, that the guns are pointing down a bit. That's not really damage to the turret, so much as it is the hull caving in. It's a striking image, with the collapsed hull coming out of the darkness. If you look at the base of the guns, in fact, you can see how close the collapse came to the turret itself. Nonetheless, it didn't reach the turret, and the guns, angle aside, are completely fine. Or as fine as they can be after 80 years underwater. They're covered in mud on the top, but beyond that, nothing to note as far as damage is concerned. With the turret done then, I'll round this off with a couple pictures from the debris field. First, a kill tally painted on part of the hull. What part, I don't know, but the paint is quite intact. It's hard to say how much is buried or lost to time, but 9 Japanese flags are still visible. So, as such, 9 kills for whichever part of the ship this is. Then there's part of her aircraft, seen here. The tail section, if I'm not mistaken, though it's so wrecked, that's hard to be sure. And finally, one of the most memorable images of the wreck. A crushed and half-buried box of spare parts. This is so memorable because the writing is almost perfectly preserved and still clearly legible. With that done, however, we reach the end of the video. USS Indianapolis is a famous ship in the same vein as Titanic, known for her sinking more than anything else about her. Her wreck, resting in the dark depths of the ocean, is one of the better preserved ones out there. One can only hope she stays that way for many, many years to come. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.